Well, it's nice to see that so many people are interested in anatomy. Well, we have to remember that it's very much the scientific side of art, and that art is much more important than just techniques. But I talk largely about techniques, as you know. Tonight I thought that I'd give you a sort of an introduction to anatomy, but actually I'm going to talk more about the spinal column than anything, because certainly it's the most important form in our body, I think, from the artist's point of view. You see, we have to remember that we're descended from animals. That is, from the Darwinian point of view. You know, as artists, you ought to regard the superstitions of scientists and the superstitions of religion with equal admiration, perhaps. But for the sake of anatomy, we're descended from animals, and we have all the same bones and muscles. And the animals, you know, four-footed animals, are in this position. You see how much we are alike? We're like the horses or the cats or anything you want, except we assume another position. But our muscles are all very much the same. And we have the inevitable spinal column or backbone, the backbone on the top of which is the head. Then we have two girdles, you know, the shoulder girdle from which the arms or forelimbs. Might be better to think of as an animal. Many of these terms come from the animals. The forelimbs descend from the shoulder girdle, and the rear limbs descend from the pelvis. And that's the great pattern that has been repeated and repeated and repeated, and hasn't been changed very much, you know, since we crawled out of the sea some time back. So I thought tonight we might draw some animal. It doesn't much matter what animal, because they're all so much alike, but I thought we might draw a horse and examine him, and then we'll examine one of our early ancestors who went about on four legs, and then see how it came about that he rose from the four-legged position to the delicately balanced individuals we are. We're on two legs, you know. No, none of the other animals walk around on two legs the way we do. The birds do pretty well, but they lean forward in front a great deal. But we stand erect and look the world in the face. A horse, the horse's anatomy is one of the easiest to learn because there are so many books on the anatomy of horses. I think they might be because they're mostly in English, and as you know, the British Empire is practically founded on the horse. And you can go to the Museum of Natural History up there, a lovely library they have, and look up the anatomy of any animal you want. But a horse naturally would have a head. He'd have a head, and we could just feel the mass of the head. We could give him an ear. There are even books up there that tell you how to find the proportion of animals in relation to their heads. A book by Ernest Thompson Seton, for instance. And I know if you take a horse's head and come down here and get a little further, you get to the shoulder blade, things like that were in those books. Now we come to a great difference. These individual vertebrae up here are called the cervical or neck vertebrae. And we're mammals, you know, we're mammals, and all mammals have 7 cervical vertebrae, with 2 exceptions, the giant sloth and the manatee. but they don't turn up here to pose at the art students' league much. It doesn't make much difference. But all the others have 7 cervical vertebrae. So do we. Also, on the animals, the skeleton of the neck moves in an S curve, which you'll see is not like us. It then turns into a profound C curve, concave to the bottom, and moves like that. That line I've drawn is the line of the animal backbone. You know, you can put a nice horse in a square if you wish. About like that, I guess. Now, when we study the backbone on men or animals, let's think of a man for a moment. It's much more important to study this front line here, which on the animal would be the bottom of the backbone. This line here, this feel here, than it is to just stroke the back of the animal. The reason is that these things called dorsal spines stick out differently in different places, and they vitiate or subdue the very strong curves of the backbone. The horse even has these things sticking out, as have indeed the dinosaurs. And they stick out in different ways. You see the backbone we could think of as a tube now. And the horse's dorsal spines, they're called, they stick out this way. So when you see the finished horse, you'd scarcely know his backbone went strongly that way, but it does. Now, the horse has hanging from his backbone, depending from his backbone, this rib cage. And right away we run into function and shape. We have 12 ribs. Both men and women have 12 ribs, despite certain superstitions. But the horse has 18. Now that's natural. He needs a great deal of air. He has to gallop over the pampas day and night, you know. He needs a lot of air. That's function creating form, you see. So the horse has a rib cage here that hangs from his backbone. And it has 18 ribs on it. Then the horse's backbone moves backward to the pelvis. And frankly, his pelvis is a great deal like ours, except that it's much flatter. It looked as if it's been run over by a very light steam roller or something like that. But you'll find, as soon as you get familiar with anatomy, it has all the same landmarks. In fact, the horse has all the same landmarks we have, you know. I think that the pelvis start about here, and we'll find many familiar things on it that we have ourselves. Now, there is one great difference between men and animals. On the rib cage, the widest dimension is across here, this side to that side. But on animals, it's from here to there. The reason is pretty clear to see. You see, we did go from this position to this position, but if we'd retain the animal rib cage, comes out like this, as you all know. You all know because your dog sits up in bed. You see his chest coming out, you see. If we'd retained that rib cage, we would fall over on our faces when we tried to stand up on 2 legs. Therefore, the horse's shoulder blade, the shoulder blade, is much more on the side of his body than ours is. Even these are not in the normal position. They've been pulled forward. I've never seen this skeleton before. It's a brand new one of some sort. And, or maybe it's an old one that has been whitewashed. I don't know. The horse has these shoulder blades, you see, like ours. Well, you notice the shoulder blade has a triangle here and a triangle here beneath what they call the spine. And on us, these triangles are much bigger for certain reasons than the top one. So the horse's shoulder blade, which is on the side of his body, he's got a couple of triangles, and he has a spine. He has a spine here. But this triangle is about the same size as that. You see, underneath the triangle, there is a cavity, or here, there's a cavity for the arm bone, and you have a simple ball and socket joint. That's why there's a simple ball there, you see. Function makes form. And the horse indeed has such a cavity right underneath the spine there. I forgot to say something rather important. On the horse's rib cage, he has coming out in front a great keel, you know, like this. That's for the attachment of these great pectoral muscles, you know. He has to do a lot of galloping. And haven't you ever seen the keel on a bird when you carve the chicken? See, the bird has to do a lot of flying and needs enormous muscles here. Well, then we have all these bones here. Though they're functionally different, first we have this bone, which we call the humerus, which come very heavy it is on the horse. And then we have these two bones here, radius and ulna. Radius falls like that. And the ulna, strangely enough, is just stuck to the radius, the little bone on the top. Now, there's an awful lot of theory there. You know, we have this peculiar ability to do this and that, see? That's called promation and supination. In fact, if we utilize this joint here, we can get 360 degrees, you see? And so we could do this sort of thing. Well, the other animals can't, you know, and that puts them at a great disadvantage. You know, they can't pull corks out of a bottle, play these. They can't do those things. We can because of this supination and pronation. Now, you can see how it takes place. There's this bone here, is just a hinge bone at the elbow. But there's this other bone here, the radius, which is a rotating bone, and it carries the hand over the ulna. And we get supination and pronation, which we'll take up in great detail sometime. But the horse's bones are locked. He can't rotate his lower arm at all. That being the case, there's no real necessity for two bones, so the ulna here has practically faded away, and is just a little bone here. From here on now, of course, we're on the horse's hand, you see. And we have these little bones in the hand we call the carpal bones. 8 of them, I imagine, which is what we have. And then we get these bones here, the metacarpals. Meta means beyond in Greek. And then the horse, as you probably know, runs around on one finger, his middle finger. And on the end of the last phalange, he has his toenail, which, of course, he calls his hoof, you see. And that's the way he's made up. You have to realize this is all hand, and it's the same in the back. In the back, this horse has a pelvis. As I say, we'll see it's goody like ours as time goes on. He has an enormous femur, they call that. The layman calls that the thigh bone, you know, the femur. Then he has a tibia, but just part of a fibula. Tibia and fibula. On these animals, if there's no turning, the secondary bone tends to die away, and you'd find on the horse here just a sort of a splinter bone, like that. Now, all this is foot from here down, you see, like that. If it were a bear, he'd have a foot a lot like ours, you see, like that in the skeletal form. And his middle toe would be the longest, you see. And he'd look very much like us. In fact, if we throw a few of our muscles on the bear, you see how much he is like us? But the horse's whole foot is rotated down this way, rotated down that way. And so we get, of course, the tarsal bones you can see in the foot there. And then one metatarsal, and then one toe, like the front. One toe. With a fingernail, which is a heel, you see, and you have a horse's skeleton. Now, all you have to know is just a little anatomy, either human or animal. You know, the funny thing is, if you know your human anatomy, you can draw animals in a very short time. I know I did that. I learned quite a lot of anatomy in this very league. And then I went up to the farm for the summer. And in no time at all I could draw all the animals on the farm, because I realized they were just like men, but walking around on four legs, you see. You see, you'd look at a rabbit and you'd think of him as a man, and then you'd think of him as a rabbit, and he comes out rabbit. Some of you who know a little anatomy, you know that we have a cervical ligament that comes from the back of our head here to the seventh cervical bump there. It's to hold our head up. The horse needs a strong one. He's got such a heavy head. So his outline here is a ligament that runs to his fourth dorsal spine. His outline in front is very much something like our sternomastoid. This thing here, which of course goes to the pit of his neck, which is down here. And then if you went into it, you'd find that all these muscles are analogous. Little biceps for you there, and all these muscles we use on the human are in here. In here we have the triceps. Hoofed animals have an extension on their shoulder blade, so that it becomes about as long as the head. Cartilaginous extension. From that, some of you know about these muscles. The serratus muscles come. And what is so peculiar, they're entirely human. The last one goes to the ninth rib, as all artists know, and so on. Latissimus dorsi, some of you know. Rectus abdominis. Great quadriceps of the leg. We go into all these things in great detail. As I said, maybe this is his calf, or calf, as they say in New York. The hamstring group comes down and goes into the fascia of the calf, you know. That beautiful rear end on the horse is not ours. It's this part of our leg back here. The backbone continues through the pelvis, as it does with ours, into a sacrum, and that turns into a tail, which we seem to have lost, except for just a little one we have here. You know, that's the human tail. Little thing here. That one's right. The one in my room is wrong. The one in my room has 4 vertebrae. This one has 3, which is right. But very few of you will have tails, you'll find, if you feel back there. And that doesn't mean that quite a lot of you weren't born with tails, because these vestigial things turn up again and again in human beings. But the wise old doctor who attended your birth probably didn't want you to know it, and he bit it off before he released you, you see. Actually, tails run in certain families. I could mention names if I wished, but I won't. Many of you may have an extra rib up here and not even know it. It's vestigial. Snakes are traveling rib cages, that's all they are. Well, there's your animal in short. Now, according to scientific theory, we are descended from four-legged animals. They're not terribly exact in this theory, as you know, and they don't quite know when it all happened. But we're descended from some, I suppose, ape-like animal who we can make up a small one here anyway. He had a head probably a good deal like ours, not much, but a good deal. He had a head and all these things we have, beard even. He had an S-shaped backbone. He had a C-shaped continuation like the horse, you see. His rib cage fell from the backbone like the horse. A little shoulder blade here, and out came his humerus, and he had a radius and ulna, and he went around maybe on his fingers and maybe flat-handed. They really don't know. He had a pelvis back here. Probably a lot like ours, except we see the great difference. His pelvis was horizontal this way. Ours is vertical that way. That's the great difference between us and the animals. But he had a little pelvis here, and out of his pelvis, of course, came his thigh bone, or femur. And then he had a radius and a tibia and fibula. And he either went around on his toes or on his full foot. He probably had a beautiful tail. Certainly we're descended from something like that. Let's give him a hat. He's our ancestor. We have to treat him with great respect. Probably had long hair. Now, the very curious thing was that something happened to this animal, and he decided to stand up on two legs and look the world in the face. The first animal that ever did it, you see. He was in this position, but he decided to stand up in this position. And as artists, we ought to know what musculature and what part of the skeleton enabled him to do that. What actually happened was probably a little prior to his standing up. He greatly developed a muscle which most animals have, but it's extremely weak and very often missing. It's a little muscle like this in the horse. It's called gluteus maximus. It's the buttocks muscle. It's this muscle back here that everybody makes fun of when they're young, and maybe even later. This muscle here. That's gluteus maximus. Aristotle, who lived well before Darwin, was wise enough to say that gluteus maximus is the distinguishing muscle of man, which indeed it is. And we'll see why. We'll see why. Gluteus maximus comes off this sacrum here. This triangle is the sacrum. And it goes into the leg bone about a third down. Quite a small drawing, but he certainly had a nice sacrum. And here it is on the side view. And you see this muscle came off that sacrum and went into his leg bone, like that. That's gluteus maximus. It still does on us. He developed that somehow. Now we can well see what happened by getting the skeleton down. You see, what happened to our ancestor was this. He developed a muscle that ran from here to there. And when that muscle contracted, it rotated the pelvis to the upright position. On this axis here, you see, it rotated the pelvis to the upright position. Well, if the pelvis went to the upright position, it had to carry the backbone in the upright position, and with it, the rib cage and the head. And we appeared, you see, in this position. Uh-oh. Well, in other words, everything, you see, this muscle pulled everything into the vertical. But that made things quite difficult, because all these other animals are firmly set on 4 feet, like a 4-legged table or the Arc de Triomphe or something like that. And they are very easily able to cope with gravity. But this new animal, which became us, had to walk about delicately balanced on 2 legs, you see. And that's much harder than you think. You don't think it's very hard because it's all done by your subconscious, you know. But even as I'm standing here, you know, there are millions of sparks going off in these neurons in the computer in the back of my head, sending individual messages down to millions of muscle fibers telling me and helping me to stand upright. It's quite a fatiguing process, actually, as anybody knows who's been in the Army. You know, these people in the Army stand like this, and all of a sudden one of them falls over, and you say, why is that? He's just standing there. But just standing here, you're doing a great deal of work, you know. A great deal of muscular work, because you have to hold yourself in balance against the force of gravity. Well, we can draw the force of gravity simply as a line that starts and goes down to the very center of the earth. There it is. And we have to contend with it at all times, and actually when we draw we think of it quite a lot, for reasons I'll bring out as we go on. The first thing that happened, as I said, was that that pelvis, the pelvic crest pointed upward, and human pelvis from the side looks a little like this. Man's legs became enormously straight. We have the straightest legs there are, you know. I'm doubling the femur because I know that gets you to the ground. The tibia and fibula, you see it down here. And there'll be a foot down here firmly planted on the ground. Top of the head would be about here. You know, when we think of the head, we think of it in terms of mass conceptions, they call them. We think of it as a ball in back frozen into an egg in front. In other words, an artist, his first idea of the head is an egg in front and a ball in back. You see. That's his mass conception of the head. He takes the rest of his life refining that. If you don't think of it that way, you're very liable to cut off the back of the head, which all laymen do. I don't quite know why. I've thought it over for years. All laymen except mothers. I know why mothers don't do it. It's because they carry their children on their knee very often. They look down and they see the cross-section of the head from the top, which most of us never think of. And they realize that this distance is about as great as this distance, you see. In fact, probably this is greater in a baby. But all an art instructor does is to try to take laymen and turn them into artists. And laymen think very differently from artists, And it's the art instructor's job to turn the layman into an artist. You see, laymen think that the most important thing about the year 1942 was that Columbus discovered America. But artists don't think that at all. They think the most important thing about the year 1942 was that was the year when Michelangelo built the snowman outside the Medici Palace, you see. And we're all full of things like that. We think very differently as artists from laymen, and laymen from us. And what you do, of course, is to go after your layman's thoughts, which are inaccurate, and try to translate them into artist thoughts. Laymen think artists just draw what they see. Did you know that? All laymen think that. Even laymen who are professors of the history of art and have never been to art schools. That always amazes me. I'm always amazed that my art historians don't go to art schools, but they don't. I had an assistant once named Henry Geltzaler, who is a professor of the history of art. And I said, Henry, why don't you go to the League? And Henry said, I get my hands all dirty. I guess that's the general attitude. Well, then this ball at the back of the head would be up here, about there, I guess. We can use the ball as a beautiful measuring device if we wish, as we'll see. Frankly, the ball is balanced on the top of gravity. Something quite mysterious about that ball. The Greeks evidently recognized it. It's an imaginary ball there. But it's also balanced on the top of the backbone. That's why the first bone is called the Atlas, because Atlas held up the world, you see. Well, there's a rib cage in here someplace. A rib cage. And the rib cage could be like that. Oh, and of course there is there's an egg in the front of the ball, you see, to make the head. So all those things, as I explained, went up there to balance themselves against gravity. But it is very evident that this animal backbone, which is that, could not hold that construction upright, you see. So the animal's backbone underwent very subtle changes and became the human backbone, and for perfectly logical reasons. In order to support the head, it had to curve under the head, you see. And then it came down here, and it had to curve under the rib cage to support the rib cage. It then goes behind the pelvis and makes a very rapid curve and turns into the sacrum, and even curves under a little to support the sacrum. So that line I've just drawn is the line of the human backbone, and artists ought to get so it's very easy to draw because it manifests itself in every figure you draw. You can see here that the whole column of the neck has to curve forward, you see. In through here, the ribs prevent this line from influencing the left-hand profile. But down here, the reason your belly sticks forward here is because of the curve of that backbone. You'd be amazed how little space there is between there and the backbone. And I often look at these very thin fashion models and wonder about them, because perfectly sure if you did this, you'd feel their backbone. It's only about so far away, you know. Twiggy would be one, or would have been one of them. Twiggy's gotten on now. She's gotten on. You can see that the whole spirit of the side view is affected by the backbone. However, as I warned you, these little spikes that stick out in different places. And the actual center line, especially through here, the actual center line is much more dependent on them in the flesh figure than it is on the front line. But the front line carries the spirit. These dorsal spines vitiate the curves, you know. But you have to learn to think of that strong front curving line. Now, I think you can see what put this man erect, this very muscle. Let's put it in on man. It comes off the sacrum and goes about 1/3 down the bone, you see. That is the first muscle we've learned, gluteus maximus. The fibers run that way. That's a muscle that will take you from this position to that position, you see. Because most laymen don't know that. I had the great misfortune to be in the Army at one time. And all of us New Yorkers lined up, and the sergeant walked by and he said, "Straighten out your shoulders." So we all went this way. But you know, he didn't know enough. He should have said, "Collect the fibers of gluteus maximus." You see, then he stood like this, which is what he wanted. That's what makes an upright character and good posture. Gluteus maximus, the buttocks. Now, you can carry this thought very far and learn a great deal about anatomy. For instance, what holds up this rib cage? Why doesn't it fall that way, or maybe that way? Or why doesn't it fall that way is the question. It's because in the center of the back here, you've got two very strong cords, one on each side, that run from the rib cage to the pelvis, approximately like that. The artists call them the strong cords. The doctors call them the erector spinae. Naturally, the head might fall forward. Those muscles are repeated up here. And artists always draw them. You see, artists like to know a little about this. They like to know about little comparative anatomy because they like to know how man and how he is different from the animals. And then they can accentuate and even characterize the human qualities if they know a little comparative anatomy. And you find artists do always accentuate these strong chords, which we can see on this splendid flayed figure. See, there they are. You see, you feel their presence up here. They're deep, you know. They have a great effect on the form. Well, if you think of the body that way, as to what holds it erect and what locks it against gravity, you might think, well, why doesn't the rib cage fall this way? And many of you know this muscle here, the straight muscle of the abdomen, they call it. You see, that prevents the body from falling that way. The student's great favorite, sternomastoid, would prevent the head from falling that way. And so it goes. Now, you can also say to yourself, what locks this joint? But it's so subtle I can't explain it now. But it is, of course, the quadriceps and the hamstring. What locks this joint? The calf muscle. Tibialis anticus, peroneus tertius, things like that we get into someday. Then think of the front view. Think of the front view and perhaps draw it sometime and try to figure out what stops the side sway of the great skeletal masses against gravity. If you do both those things, you'll know the major muscular groups and muscles that artists use when they draw the body. I think now we should have a little recess, and I'll be back, and we'll go into the dissection of the rib cage. Thank you. I thought now we might go into some very explicit anatomy of the rib cage. I might warn you right away that this is a medical specimen. It's not made for artists. It's inaccurate in many ways. Particularly inaccurate are these pieces of linoleum here that represent the cartilages in the front of the rib cage. The curve of the backbone is hardly vital enough through here, and several other things we'll pick up as we go on. In other words, he's much more like a dead man than a live man, the way all medical specimens are. Doctors are not interested in our problems altogether. They don't care much about proportion, you know, and very little about illusionary drawing and that sort of thing. So beware a bit of medical specimens. Think of the living, not of the dead. Get the feel of the skeleton off yourself, because in most cases you're alive, you know. So are the models. So let's take a good, intense look at the rib cage. Maybe just front and side. We could start off with the head, and if we start off with the head, we might start off with that imaginary ball in the back. There is quite a lesson in proportion to be drawn from that. The diameter of that ball is 5 eyes wide. You know, it's back here. And the head is narrow in front. But it's supposed to be 5 eyes across. You know, if you took another eye out here, it'd be about here, which is that. That measurement is incredible in terms of proportion, in that it turns up so many times in the body, as if perhaps the celestial engineers who designed this body had that measurement in mind. It's about, most skeletons about like that. And you see, you take that, and then somewhat to your surprise, you'll find that the shoulder blades are about the same that way and that way. The arm bone, I think this is a little too long, this thing. The arm bone is 2 of them. The leg bone from the great trochanter there is 3 of them. The sternum, this bone here on the front elevation, is 1. Double it, and you get to the bottom of the rib cage as the artists consider it, the tip of the 10th rib. It's the width of the collarbone on the front elevation. It's any number of things. So much so that you might well enclose this in a 5-eyed cube. And you find that it will become very useful for proportion, that 5-eyed cube, in many ways. It will hit many landmarks. And also, if you can think in terms of cubes, or perhaps rectangular solids, which are nothing but an interpolation of the average cube, then of course you can find out about perspective. You see, as far as figure drawing goes, you have to use perspective if you want to get an illusion. But the only way we use perspective is to imagine the body encased in various rectangular solids. If they're related to the 5-eyed cube, it sometimes makes things a little easier. That means you people ought to practice all the time if you want to move to perspective in blocking up parts of the body. For proportional purposes, blocking up skeletal masses is better than anything. You see, in proportions, we have to depend on skeletal landmarks. The reason is that skeletons are all very much alike. Their proportions are evidently forced by their function, and you know we all do about the same thing. But then we get this flesh on, you see, so that individuals were all different. Beware of fleshy landmarks. Beware, you know, a lot of people say you take one head and then you take one more head and you hit the nipple. Well, that's all very well, but you know that nipples, as age overtakes us, on some people get lower and lower and lower. They say maybe take another one to the navel. Well, the navel is sort of a traveling salesman. It moves all around, you know. You can't depend on the flesh, as you might well know by this time, especially if you've had a religious upbringing. The flesh is inconsistent, but you can depend on the skeleton. If you go to a cocktail party of skeletons, you won't be able to tell one from another. You'd have to be really quite an expert to tell the males from the females. You really would. So remember that what you ought to do, really, if you want to draw the figure beautifully, is to get sort of a secret skeleton in your mind with the proportions you feel are the average, so that you can measure it against the model. And then, of course, you can tell where things should be made larger or smaller according to the character of the model, because they'll depart from what you feel is the normal. Actually, you can't see any differences in people unless you have in your mind what you think is the normal. A famous example is the old art school rule of the rule of 3, from the widow's peak to the top of the nose, and from the nose to the chin. It's a great rule of 3 in the art schools. Once you know that, you can look at anybody in this room and tell whether they adhere to it or depart from it, and where. You see it instantly. And you can apply that type of thinking to the whole body if you so wish. All you have to do is to come to an agreement with yourself as to what is normal. Nobody knows what it is, you know. Not even the anthropologists. Nobody knows. So it's your responsibility to have your own secret figure, which you consider to be normal, against which you can measure the model. Well, if we double this box, this is a front view, we'd find the pit of the neck was there. Then we find if we take 4 of these things, 4 or 5-eyed cubes, we can get a that's off. We can get a very nice rib cage box for perspective and proportional purposes. There are 4 little cubes in there, you see. We find somewhat to our surprise that a woman, her pelvis will take the same box. Now, don't think of that thing as flat. Think of it from the side, maybe. Or think of it in an odd position. It's made up of 4 cubes. And see them in there? It's a real solid. Made up of 4 cubes. Be a line across here. That's rather rough, but that's the idea. Now, when we come back down the back of the neck, the first landmark we hit is the 7th cervical dorsal spine, this thing here. You can all feel it in the back of your neck. It's a great landmark for artists and for doctors. The doctors always, the way they tell which one of these vertebrae you have trouble in is to count from down here, you know. They know this one. 7th cervical. It's in the back there, about an eye and a quarter up. Now, if we look at the rib cage from this position, which is really the animal position, we can see the first ribs coming around like both of them together making a circle. Artists stretch the point a little, and they draw a constructional circle, which they call the base of the column of the neck, from that point and back to the pit of the neck here, you see. About 4 eyes wide, I guess, that thing. That's the base of the cylinder of the neck. That's a constructional line. It also is a reflection of the first ribs. It's both. You see, of course, the neck rises from the first ribs. And you have to draw it that way. That's why you ought to draw rib cages quite often when you draw the model. Throw them in. Because you have to bring the neck out of the first ribs. Because you swallow down there and you breathe through there. And if you put the neck up over here someplace, the way people do, the poor model couldn't live, you know. Now, you'll see in the front here a bone which is badly flattened out. They're the doctors for you. They don't care. We care a lot. This bone here is called the sternum bone. The ancients haven't thought of it as a sort of a dagger. And they called the top piece the handle, and the second piece the blade. And for that reason they called it the manubrium, the top one, which means handle. That's gladiolus, that's blade. There's a silly little piece of cartilage that isn't here. Well, maybe it's covered with paint, I guess it is. They call the ensiform cartilage down here. Well, the manubrium artists think of quite carefully because it's right here, it's right under the skin, and fat very seldom forms over it. And you can always see it. It is a bone like this. It has a place for the pit of the neck and a place for the collarbones, and then a place for the cartilage of the first rib, and then half a place for the cartilage of the second, and then a strong line across. That's a famous line. The line of the angle of the sternum, they call it. So the old manubrium is up here. And underneath it is the gladiolus, which simply has places for 6½ ribs. I think I ought to draw a side view of all this so you can feel the protuberance of the rib cage, which is so important. See, if we drew with the side view, we'd throw the ball of the head in that top box. And we'd feel the face in front as a sort of an egg frozen in there. In terms of mass, we'd find the point of the seventh cervical about there, and the pit of the neck about here. And we could feel the constructional circle, except we're seeing it from the side, and we're seeing it as in what they call orthographic drawing, orthographic, or architect's drawing. Perhaps we ought to think a little about lines and what they mean. You see, if I draw a line, every layman thinks I'm drawing a line. But naturally, lines don't exist. They're mental concepts. That is, they don't exist in the three-dimensional world. They have only length. They really don't exist. They're mental ideas. If I looked at that under the microscope, I'd see a big mountain range of charcoal, you know. Yet it means a lot to people, lines do, because we draw with lines. Principally, we use lines to show the meeting of planes. If I take a piece of paper and bend it, nobody's at all surprised if I do that, you see, even though lines don't exist. And we begin to realize that in drawing we deal with mental concepts entirely. But that line there might also give you the illusion of a plane on end, you see, or anything drawn on that plane. This line here could give you the illusion of a plane on end with a circle drawn on it, if you wish. Laymen accept these things. They don't think about them, they accept them. Anybody ever seen a line in a photograph? Suppose I make a point like that, what does it mean? In the first place, that's not a point. It's a veritable Everest of charcoal under the microscope. But it certainly can give us many illusions. It could give us the illusion of a line on end, you know. These are greatly used by artists for position. Constructional points are used for position. You can't get students to use constructional lines, which is the only way you can teach them how to draw, because they feel they mess up their beautiful drawings and they won't draw them. You know, they want to take their drawings home and show them to their mothers, and they don't want to mess them up with all sorts of constructional boxes, which is about the only way to learn how to draw, you know. And maybe the horizon line and the central visual plane. They won't draw that, you know, ever in my classes. Yet they can't learn to draw unless they do, you know. Contour lines teach you how to draw. Little lines that run over the skin, like a little bug with ink on his feet. That'll teach you how to draw. But it probably upsets your mother. But don't let your mother criticize your drawings. Take your drawings to the professionals, you know. That's true of writers, too, if there are any here. The manubrium, that's this thing, goes at this angle. The gladiolus goes at this angle. At the bottom of the gladiolus is a lozenge-shaped piece of cartilage called the ensiform cartilage. Here it's vertical. You might notice these angles are breaking here equally. See those little angles? In a way, that's of the utmost importance, because unless you bring the chest out the way it is in the living figure, you know, you sing it in and you give a dispirited feel to your picture. So try to remember the movement of the sternum bone, which is dispirited here. It's all flat. It's no good. He's dead. Look at the living model. Feel yourself. Feel yourself a lot. Feel everybody. Feel statues. You've got more feeling in your fingers than you have in your eyes. After all, if you look at things, all you just see is just the front of them. You don't get any volume. God knows what goes on in back. You know, you really don't know. You think you know. But maybe there's a whole McDowell hamburger chain back here, something like that. You don't know. You look at the model. You think you know from experience. You only see the front planes of objects, you know. And so you draw an outline. And what is an outline? It's where planes are meeting. It's where the front plane you see meets the back plane you don't see. That's all an outline is. It doesn't exist, of course. Well, as often in anatomy, a little thing like that, the ensiform cartilage, which the layman terms the pit of his stomach for some odd reason. You know, laymen feel themselves all over, and all of a sudden they feel here and they feel a lump. And they think, oh my God, I got cancer. And they run to the doctor, you see, and the doctor said, oh, that's nothing but the ensiform cartilage or the xiphoid appendage. Don't worry about it. But you can feel that right there. Big lump. Well, as often we use it for odd reasons. We use that to show the greatest width of the rib cage on the front view. Every time you rotate the rib cage, the outlines change, you know. So artists have to more or less memorize how they are on the front view and the 3/4 and the back. Of course, the back's just like the front. But the thing about this ensiform is, if you run a horizontal through there and then bring down the outline of the rib cage, it'll be widest at that point on the front and back views. And it'll come down to here, which is a landmark and which is the tip of the 10th rib. That's this, tip of the 10th rib. Now, I think you can see, we'll draw a cross-section someday, but I think you can see that the ribs come around from the back and they suddenly hit a piece of cartilage, which here is linoleum. And the cartilage then goes up, in this district anyway, it goes down a little there, it goes up to the sternum, you see. So the ribs come around from the back. Now, how do you draw ribs? You rely on the artist's old saying that all lines run over conceived form, you see. And you learn to draw the artist's mass conceptions, the box and the cylinder and the ovoid or egg and the ball and a few others that fringe conception. The spool is a beauty. Cézanne talked about the cone a great deal. That's a good one. There are a few others. The donut's a nice one. Now, the reason for all these things is there isn't any form on this human body that isn't either one of these on the whole, such as the sphere in the back of the head, or which hasn't on its surface any plane you wish on the body. What is the belly but the protrusion of the front of a sphere, don't you see? Almost all muscular planes are that sort of thing, convex that way and convex that way. Occasionally you get just a convex plane, but you can get them all off the skin of these things. If you go further than the body, you have to examine interior planes, such as the interior of that cylinder. That's a concave plane. And we have concave planes if we break our egg open and look on the inside, you know. It's very curious on this skeleton that on the flesh body, I just like to say, there are no planes that are concave the same way. If you don't know what concave and convex mean, whisper to your neighbor and they'll tell you. A lot of people don't, you know. On this flesh body, or that one, you'll find very few concave planes. You'll find one or two concave convex, such as this here, or the Achilles tendon. But on the skeleton, you'll find all kinds of concave planes all over the place. But those aren't the ones that ever come through the flesh. If any bone comes through the flesh, it's going to have convex qualities. Like this whole bone here is right under the flesh. You see, it's convex. And the reason, of course, is that we did come from the sea, according to the superstitions of the scientists, as I said. We came from the sea, and concave planes would slow us up, you see. We have to be streamlined to get through the water. But you need to learn about concave planes for general drawing purposes, you know, because they abound in many artifacts made by man, but very few by nature. The ribs, of course, we can learn to draw if we practice drawing lines over eggs. You see, around the front and around the back is a very good idea. You want to learn to draw spirals of hair, draw them around the back and front of the cylinder. You draw beautiful spirals of hair like Botticelli, who was the best hairdresser that ever lived. You know, that man was terribly original with hair. I would think they'd pick him up and take some of those hairdos he thought up. If I want to draw the fifth rib, I know that it ends here, and I just run over the conception, and I get a beautiful rib, you see. Or the first rib, I feel the conception. Not much of the 10th to be seen here. Artists know all the ribs, it may surprise you to know, quite well. But if you learn the first, which is easy, the fifth, which comes on the halfway point, and the 10th, which hits the bottom of our mass conception, you really know them all. Because you just know that, well, the third would be here, and the fourth, and the fifth, and, you know, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th. Just the way artists know all the ribs, they also know every one of these dorsal spines. And for good reason, too, which we'll bring out. But they just learn 3 of them, actually, and then they know all the rest. Notice that fifth rib does end about halfway between here and here. And then it turns into cartilage and moves up to the sternum. Now, there's an important line here where the ribs meet the cartilage, which the artist is very fond of. It's called the line where the ribs meet the cartilage. You see, each rib meets the cartilage at a certain point. You know, it's not quite right here because the man has pulled his paint a little back on the ribs. We'll have to get a better skeleton next time. My own in there, I don't mean this one, that one in there is much better. Artists draw a line through the place where the ribs meet the cartilage. It's that line there. You'll see it in good anatomy books. And they have good reason for doing so. In the first place, the ribs come around and have to stop there. Second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. See how easy they are to draw? And then the ribs turn into cartilages, you see, and they go to their insertions. Now, on a normal figure, the first 7 ribs have their own cartilages, and they're called true ribs. The 3 ribs below share their cartilage with the rib above, in that fashion. And they're called false ribs. You have 2 more, but they're not of really great importance, these here. They get buried in the flesh a great deal. But it's wise to know them for certain positions, you'll see them. Of course, all the same on the other side. I suppose here I'm playing a sort of an artist trick. This cartilaginous edge is different in everybody, like so many things. And if the model takes a deep breath, it is very visible. Now, heaven knows, things in here are moving all the time on account of breathing. And then, you know, my beginners who think all drawing is just a copy will come up to me and say, I want to draw this part of the body. Will you please tell the model to stop breathing? And it has something to do with this edge here. It is different in everybody, and that means I guess it's pretty much up to you to figure out how you like to have it. My own little secret figure has 2 big curves and 2 little ones. But it does vary if you consult all the books and look at all the skeletons. On the side view, let's look at the outline of the rib cage. We'll find it'll stick out the most here. And then it'll move about to the halfway position here. You could say as a generality the tip of the 10th rib is there. You see, those are landmarks that we indicate by points when we draw. Very often we proceed our figure, you know, down the page with points of landmarks. Some of them are the utmost importance. Now, look and see what the cartilages do. They come way out before they go back. Every single beginner or layman will cut that in like that. It is not well illustrated here at all. It'll be well illustrated on you. You can feel this great mass down here of these cartilages. Don't cut into it. Almost everybody in the beginning, when they draw a woman, will make a big bite here, a concave bite, but it doesn't exist. The rib cage is a great convex mass, you know, and it is a solid mass, and you can't infringe on it in any way. Well, there's a rib cage. I'm going to do the back view later when we do the shoulder girdle. We might just anticipate the pelvis and some of our ideas. Here are 2 of the most famous landmarks in the whole of drawing. Those are these pelvic points on the pelvis. You see, one here and one there. And what do we learn? What do we use landmarks for? You know that almost all our lines run from one skeletal landmark to another skeletal landmark. And one thing you have to learn to do when you draw a line is to figure out where it starts and where it's going to end before you draw it. Now, that takes quite a little while, and it means you have to know where the landmarks are. But you study a bit, and it doesn't take very long. And it does seem logical, you know, because you go to the airline office and you say, I want to take a trip on one of your lines. And the man says, well, do you know where you want to go? You say, no. And then the man might say, well, do you know who you are? You say, no. Well, he says, well, I don't think I can sell you a ticket under those circumstances. You see, if we draw a line, we know where it starts, we know where it ends. Sometimes these lines, like the anterior edge of latissimus dorsi, start in the front of the body and spiral around to the point in the back. And yet we want to make pretty sure when they sort of leave our view that they're going in the right directions. Artists often hook them a little, you know, towards the direction they're going. Well, there are a lot of facts and details and really a lot of science for you. But you know, that isn't quite what art is. We may take off from science, and we may take off from the landing fields of science and the jet planes of art, but it isn't all technique, you know. So I thought that I would have to say every time just a little something about what it is to be an artist. And I thought I would remind you that we are the intellectuals. We are the artists. We are the music makers. We are the dreamers of dreams, wandering by lone sea breakers, sitting by desolate streams, world losers and world forsakers, on whom the pale moon beams. But we are the movers and shakers of the world forever, it seems. With wonderful deathless ditties we build up the world's great cities, and out of a fabulous story we fashion an empire's glory. One man with a dream at pleasure shall go forth and conquer a crown, and two with a new song's measure shall trample an empire down. We in the ages lying in the buried past of the earth built Nineveh with our sighing, and Babel itself with our mirth. Then o'erthrew them with prophesying to the old of the new world's worth. For each age is a dream that is dying, or one that is coming to birth. Thank you.